Chapter 18: The Growth of Rural Industry by Garrett Béchamp and Matthew Wolfer.
What allowed the growth of rural industry in Europe? How did it operate? And what sort of impact did it have on Europe?
Just some quick background on what happened before the growth of rural industry and what made it possible. The agricultural revolution created more logistical means of farming. It made farming more efficient, and it generated a surplus of food and also lowered the demand for peasant farmers, which decreased the value of their labor because of more effective means of farming. The surplus food was a huge factor in the explosion of population across Europe of the time. Extra food, more people ate, less people starved, less people died. Also, less people died because of improvements in sanitation and medicine, namely the inoculation of smallpox. Some improvements in sanitation include new means of sanitizing water as well as disposal of sewage and waste. Another factor, believe it or not, that improved population across Europe was absolutism. As enlightened despots such as Joseph II and Frederick the Great came along, they had better control over their domains than rulers of previous eras because of the absolutist reign, and also the ideas of cameralism that they took on and the constant betterment and progression of society gave them the ability to actually tend to the issues of their domains.
This graph demonstrates the explosion of population in Europe after 1700, mainly after 1720 when the final bout of plague ended in Marseille.
A huge part to understanding the growth of rural industry at the time is the cottage industry. Now, the cottage industry was the industry in which peasants independently produced goods at home workshops for commercial sale. They needed to do this to supplement their payments because they didn't have as much money as they did before because of poor agricultural earnings as a result of the agricultural revolution. This is something that peasant communities always have done. They've always processed clothing, food, and housing, but they've never done it on a large scale like this and for sale on the commercial market. And it ends up replacing farming as the primary source of income for the majority of peasants because of the decline in value of agricultural labor, and resultingly becomes a crucial feature of the European economy during that time.
The cottage industry was funded by the putting out system. In this system, capitalist merchants supplied rural workers with the raw materials they needed to produce their goods in exchange for a cut of the sale. This grew because of the competitive nature of the putting out system. The abundance of underemployed laborers led to the exploitation and undercutting of the desperate workers. The division and specialization of labor also increased the productivity as well as the variety of goods able to be produced.
The textile industry was not only the largest industry in Europe, but it was also the best example of the cottage industry working with the putting out system. The handloom cottage industry was usually done by a whole family and household, usually led by the man of the household, who was the one doing the actual weaving and operating the loom, while wives, children, and other workers would perform tasks such as the spinning. And commonly there were up to 4 or 5 spinners to one weaver. And the average family wasn't that large at this time, so outside help was usually needed to make up for the extra spinning, and as a result of this, merchants would utilize wives and daughters of agricultural workers, as well as single women and widows, largely so to the point that the term spinsters was coined as meaning an unmarried woman. There was always conflict between weavers and merchants. There was a lot of suspicion. Merchants would always accuse workers of stealing materials, which they probably did, and weavers would always complain that it only seemed that way because underweight bales were delivered in the first place, which probably also happened. Disputes arose also about wage, of course, between the merchants and weavers because the weavers didn't believe that they were getting paid a fair price, but if there was nothing they could do about it because there was no other work because of the agricultural revolution. Take, for example, in England, a male weaver earned 12 shillings per week to a woman's 3 shillings per week. So the single women and widows of the time struggled especially hard.
Here's a picture of a loom. Some say, begin and learn some other business. Suppose we do. Who will maintain our families whilst we undertake the arduous task? And when we have learned it, how do we know we shall be any better for our pains? For by the time we have served our second apprenticeship, another machine may arise, which may take away the business also, so that our families, being half behind whilst we are learning how to provide them with bread, will be wholly so during the period of our third apprenticeship. Hepworth. This is actually a petition by an English cottage worker against the development of nearby factories. Although the cottage industry did develop into the Industrial Revolution, the two could not exist at the same time. This also demonstrates how closely the livelihood of its workers were to the cottage industry.
The 18th century saw the beginning of the changes that were to turn Burnley into an industrial town. The woolen trade was well established and two new developments were taking place. Textile manufacture was still mainly carried out under the domestic system, also known as the cottage industry, in which the cloth was made in the worker's own home. As it took several spinners to keep a weaver supplied with yarn, the whole family was usually involved in the work. This is actually a secondary source providing some more insight on how the cottage industry works. It talks about the textile manufacturing, which was the most common example of the cottage industry, and actually the textile industry provided more jobs across Europe than any other industry, basically from the time of the cottage industry up through the Industrial Revolution. It talks about also how the cottage industry would usually be set up in a worker's own home, with a weaver working the yarn, again usually a male, with the several remaining members of the family, because the whole family was involved, working as spinners.
The Industrial Revolution was a change in the socio-economic views of northwestern European families. They began to focus on jobs which gave them wages instead of producing their own goods for their survival. Although it may have reduced their economic self-sufficiency, but increased their ability to purchase consumer goods. This not only benefited the families, but it also worked to create a commercial European economy. It was also a necessary precursor to the Industrial Revolution. This is the first time, and not the last, that women and children would be the primary source of labor. More finished goods became available at lower prices, allowing families to acquire more and more. With the increase of female workers, many believe that today we are going a second industrial revolution in which the social attitude reflects the goal of productivity.
The agricultural revolution, in combination with the political, medical, and sanitary advancements of the time, allowed for the population in Europe to increase, and this allowed for the peasants to focus on outside sources of income, such as cottage industry. The peasants, who were supplied by merchants through the putting out system, were able to produce goods to supplement their incomes. And this was a result of the decreasing need and value of agricultural labor. And this extra money that they had to spend on the surplus of finished goods that were being created, also resultingly of the cottage industry, laid the groundworks for the Industrial Revolution, because it created a new consumer-based commercial economy all across Europe.